usual of gauchely suburban youths in a prim as pinstripe seaside town in the 1930s. Swansea and the world don't know it yet, but this cell of rebel suburbanites is about to explode in a starburst of creativity.
One of them, Dylan Thomas, will emerge as a poetic genius of world renown.
Today it's hard to see Dylan Thomas poet, for Dylan Thomas grotesque bardic cliché.
Perhaps as a result, it's even harder to see the other Welsh artists who were his most significant and closest friends before any one of them had made a reputation. The Cardoma Cafe, Castle Street, Swansea, Dylan's ugly, lovely town, was for a time the hub of their creative universe.
Pre-war Swansea, you see, was a very, very rigid, conventional, narrow place. And that's what's always amused me about the Cardoma, that they chose this very respectable cafe where all the shopping ladies went and the retired clergymen, people like that, you know, to have this loud talk about, what was it Dylan said, Picasso and girls. And they must have done it in the middle of the shocked, horrified and rather pleased Swansea ladies.
Dylan in Cardoma days was just one of a highly gifted gang, and by no means yet the dominant figure. There was Daniel Jones, composer, the towering intellect of the group, Fred James, defiantly modernist painter, and Vernon Watkins, whom death would rob of the Poet Laureate's job.
The group was not regular or exclusive. The writer John Pritchard, composer Tom Warner, Mervyn Levy, artist, Charlie Fisher from the Evening Post, and Bert Trick, communist grocer, all dropped in for a coffee and some scintillating chat.
My studio was only a couple of 100 yards away in College Street, just round the corner. And Tom would pick me up. Tom was a great, very social person, loved to talk and so on. And he'd pick me up on the way down. He'd call in the studio, pick me up, we'd go round to Cardoma and have this coffee. And various other people would turn up.
It was a time of youthful ambition. Today we remember Dylan Thomas, but there are others whose work has stood the test of time. The first of these is the composer, Daniel Jones. Dan was a talented musician, already a prolific composer, an all-round prodigy.
Dan was the Renaissance man, and he knew everything. He really did know everything. It was extraordinary. You couldn't mention any subject that he didn't know.
Dan and Dylan had known each other since Swansea grammar school days. At Warmley, Dan's home, Dylan and other members of the gang were welcomed in to the creative and slightly bohemian atmosphere. Dylan's short story, The Fight, records his first visit there.
My new friend's mother answered the door with a ball of wool in her hand. Dan, in the upstairs drawing room, heard my arrival and played the piano faster. I didn't hear you come in, he said, when I found him. He finished on a grand chord, stretching all his fingers. The room was splendidly untidy, full of wool and paper and open cupboards stacked with things you could never find. All the expensive furniture had been kicked. A waistcoat hung on the chandelier. I thought I could live forever in that room, writing and fighting and spilling ink.
You could not be a friend of Dan's without being completely interested in music, as it were. It is so dynamic, and his knowledge of music is absolutely enormous. It's very like a religion in a way, and this enormous energy that he had, and humour, sense of humour.
Older than most of the others, Vernon Watkins was the only one at this point who held down a salaried job in Lloyd's Bank, where he worked as a clerk.
He said the bank was wonderful because it gave him a salary. He could do the ledgers and things with about 10% of his brain, and behind was incubating for the evening when he could write his poetry. When Vernon and Dylan met in Cumdonkin Drive, Vernon would go there when he'd finished in the bank. They would read the poems, I think mostly Dylan's poems, and every single word would be discussed. Let's have a totally different line. Let's leave that line. I don't like it very much. No, the stress is wrong in that line. We've got to have something with the stress on the first syllable. They both realised that here, uniquely, was another person as totally interested in poetry as they were.
On one occasion, Dylan had asked Vernon to come along and meet him in Cumdonkin Drive, and asked me if I'd like to go along. And we all met there, and that was another very long friendship.
Fred James, painter, musician, was perhaps the most original of the group, and with a startling eye for any incongruity. I remember I was sewing once, and I happened to put up my scissors like that. And he said, stay there, that's wonderful. The eye with the two scissors. They were all originals, really. It was an extraordinary group. It's just, as I say, a pity that there wasn't a Boswell there to take everything down, and a camcorder would have been wonderful, but it's lost now.
A portrait of the artist as somebody else is what we call this famously inadequate statue. But with the chair facing west towards deeper Wales and the figure gazing hopefully in the direction of London, it does make a point about the aspirations of most of the Kardomah's set. If Swansea was their second city, London was their first. Land of my fathers, he'd said, leaving Swansea for London, my fathers can keep it.
It's impossible for me to tell you how much I want to get out of it all. Out of narrowness and dirtiness. Out of the eternal ugliness of the Welsh people and all that belongs to them. Out of the pettiness of a mother that I don't care for and a giggling batch of relatives. What are you doing? You're always writing. What do you know? You're too young to write. I shall have to get out soon or there will be no need. I'm sick. And this bloody country's killing me.
Dylan and two others of the group, Fred James and Mervyn Levy, took lodgings together in London.
They took a flat in Redcliffe Gardens, Earl's Court. There was practically no furniture. If you went and visited the three of them, and apparently it was quite a popular place for people who came up from the Cardoma set. They would go around to Redcliffe Gardens and sit on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit, and my father would sit on the chest of drawers and read out his latest book review, whatever he'd managed to find that was going to pay him some money.
You just could not get on unless you went to London. It would have meant, of course, fame and fortune. It would have meant that you could publish or exhibit or have your music performed. You couldn't have it done in Cardiff or in Swansea. There just weren't Welsh magazines until 1937, for example.
But you stepped out of the academy and straight into Cork Street, into the modern galleries and so on. And you, from the life class in the academy, you stepped straight into Picasso, Modigliani, Braque, Paul Klee and so on. And that, I think, altered my view entirely.
Throughout his long career, Fred James's work has been notable for an openness to new influences. But he began life as a portrait painter, taking commissions and painting many members of the Kardomah gang.
This portrait of Vernon Watkins by Alfred James is a very important painting for me. As a young boy, I used to live quite close to the Glynvivian Art Gallery, and Saturday morning was my treat, and I'd come and browse whatever was on show. But this painting was the one that I would always stop at and spend time looking at. First of all, I think I was struck by the kindness of the subject. I didn't know who Vernon Watkins was, but I knew that he must have been a very kind and gentle man.
A lot of people are very affected by his portraiture, let alone the character that he's portraying, the personality. There are all these textures of the clothing, of the hair, of the skin that come through and just come together on a very small scale as an incredible work of art.
In these 4 still lives from the 1930s, the apparent naturalism is shaped and ordered to reveal pattern and geometry. Fred relates this to his interest in music.
One was very much preoccupied with the way in which time is divided into definite bars, and the whole idea of music structured. If you notice the whole of the patterns here, they're all structured on the main object. Yes. So you have the exposition, as it were, the kipper and the jug and the pineapple, they're all basically the same oval and tailed shape. So you've got that basic pattern to start off with. And then with the detail, all these patterns are made up of kippers and pineapples, so that one developed it. It was very largely a musical influence.
As with other members of the Cardoma gang, there's an obvious craftsmanship apparent in the attention to detail and in the masterly control of his medium, the paint.
He loves the paint that he's dealing with, the texture of the hyacinths, for instance. And someone said, actually, that paint service comes out like a jewel. Whatever the colour, whatever the texture, it just comes through in a very powerful way. There's almost an eeriness about them sometimes, I feel. He was pushing to develop something else through these works. The later works, which are much more progressive, much more abstract, as we've mentioned, but he still enjoys all these challenges of geometric forms. The linear qualities, they're all still there.
That's perhaps one of the most recent ones I did. But it's not as geometric as the others, it's freer, but it's largely about ambiguity, coming and going from really representational bits to completely abstract bits, as it were. A kind of gallimaufry, I suppose, you know, shapes and colours and so on. Restless, I think.
Restless.
In other words, once one could do something, if I could do something, I want to do something else. As soon as one's able to do that, one's interest has been in the experiment, to experiment all the time.
Energy, which all their lives they had in abundance, needs control before it becomes art. It needs craft. They were shapers and transformers. They didn't want to churn out nice scour views or prosy snapshots of domestic life. They were into the serious business of bringing new creations into the world. A good poem, Sir Dillon, is a contribution to reality.
Dear Vernon, thank you for the poems. I like them all. Manner is magnificent. I still don't like the first line. Perhaps I never mentioned it, but from the beginning, from the first time I saw the poem shaping, I felt the line to be wrong. Disliked, fabled.
Not because it's used as a verb, but because of its position, and felt uneasy about the rhythm.
The rhythm is one that I myself have used to death, and my feeling against it is perhaps over-personal. The line is so stridently an opening line. Tum, tum, tum. All the wheels and drums are put in motion. A poem is about to begin. I see the workman's clothes. I hear the whistle blowing in the poem factory.
This idea of the poet as a, you know, Shelley wandering among the early fields and listening to the skylark was not on at all. Painting, music and poetry were hard work. You know, the medieval word, the maker, for a poet is what they all were. Makers, craftsmen, like carpenters, almost working away. Vernon said that after he met Dillon, he burnt 2,000 drafts of poems that he'd made. Just burnt them. He realised they were no good.
I tread the sand at the sea's edge, sand of the hourglass, and the sand receives my footprint singing. You are my nearmost, you who have travelled the farthest, and you are my constant, who have endured all vicissitudes in the cradle of sea, fate's hands and the spinning waters.
Because we've gone over to free verse very much, the metrical subtlety in Watkins, I'm sure, is lost these days. I don't think people quite appreciate what he was capable of and how few poets can do the kind of things he was doing with meter, with rhythm, with internal vowel music. It's absolutely astonishing, and there's hardly a bad poem in his collected poems. Watkins always said that he wrote for the ear, whereas Dylan Thomas would start with an idea and build up from the idea. Vernon Watkins would hear a sound or a phrase and work towards a greater music.
I stoop to gather a seabird's feather fallen on the beach, torn from a beautiful drifting wing. What can I learn or teach, running my finger through the comb and along the horny quill? The body it was torn from gave out a cry so shrill, sailors looked from their white road to see what help was there.
All his poems are on a very lofty plane. He seldom drops below a certain level. There's nothing vulgar. There's no irony in his work. It's always very straight down the line. No sex, no humour. But for all that, it's wonderful poetry. He sees the life beyond this life. He sees the spiritual realities, the archetypal realities. He's trying to make a myth. He's trying to show us that there's a kind of world beyond the everyday.
Every evening when it was light enough, Vernon would go for a walk along the cliffs. I think the Gower light, which is very extraordinary, meant a tremendous amount to him, and of course they figure in his poetry a great deal.
Pushed out from the rocks, pushed far by old thought, long into night, under starlight, at last, tired from my coastal labouring, I come to you, sleepless Rossili. I have cut through the mirror-bright sea in the long, slender boat with 2 paddles, and ground in the sand. Dawn breaks. I stare, amazed at the marvel.
Dylan's life, meanwhile, was dominated by more practical concerns. He was more or less nomadic, and invariably strapped for cash.
God, I almost forgot. Are you rich temporarily? Would you like to lend me some money, £1, or at the very most £2? I have a beastly vital debt, rather a lot. Of course, you don't mind me asking you, but if you're broke or holiday saving, I can get a few pounds elsewhere, though not, Mr. Watkins, with such lack of embarrassment as I can ask you for it. Yours always again, Dylan.
Friendship survived lots of things. Survived, for example, Dylan Thomas not turning up to be the best man at Vernon Watkins' wedding. It survived him asking him regularly for cash, asking him to type his poems for him, asking him to lend him a suit. The relationship survived all these things.
He always happily bummed. He could always bum a pint and a sandwich, you know, off somebody, or go round and catch things from Fred, whose father was a greengrocer. And Dylan said if ever he was starving, he would go to Fred's and he'd find there a putrescent lobster which Fred had been slowly painting, you know, and they boiled it up. He could always manage. He didn't care about money.
His first symphony was indeed the first symphony composed by a Welsh composer. And for him then to have gone on and written 13 symphonies, that is, I think, a major achievement. His string quartets are very, very fine. I think certainly the equal of anything else being written in the 20th century by any composer in Wales, or indeed outside Wales. I think he's a major figure. Dan spent his morning at his desk and most of the rest of the day was spent in the pub at the Newton Inn. He was a very, very generous man, and was very much enjoyed by all the people who knew him.
When you talk to people in the Newton Inn about him, that comes across, you know, this friendliness, this openness. I think he found himself a niche in that pub where he could go each day to escape, as it were, the obligations of his craft and his working at music every day.
I remember asking him about composition, how difficult was it? Was it the case perhaps that for every piece of paper, every sheet of manuscript that he kept, he might have discarded 8 or 9 others? And he said, oh, good God, no, far more than that. And it was an agonizing process.
He was a traditionalist, working in tonal forms, easily accessible forms, in fact, and then using traditional structures as well, sometimes in novel ways. He actually set up a technique he called complex meters, where different rhythms are juxtaposed at the same time, creating, when you are listening very carefully to them, a sort of characteristic ambiguity.
Now, in dance fantasy, I have this example. Now, first of all, the accompaniment is an illustration of the complex meters, and it goes 2, 3, 3, 2, like this.
Often is a feeling of loneliness, and he recognized that as being descriptive of his own feeling as being eccentric in the sense that he was outside things. He didn't belong anywhere in particular other than his own village. He was outside the musical establishment, university, the Arts Council, BBC and so on.
Wales was very important to him. Somebody once talked about Wales in the experience of all these Cardoma creative artists as lurking outside the door. Subconsciously, he himself identified certain things that, as a creative artist, he felt that in his work he reflected. Things like lyricism, for example, a love of craft, which he regarded as being Celtic, perhaps. One thinks of Celtic knotwork, for example.
Even those like Fred James, who eventually settled in London, returned frequently to what Daniel Jones called this magnet city. Over time, the circle widened, from Swansea itself to include Mumbles, Gower and Larne beyond. But Wales remained at the heart of their identity.
It's strange to think of you, Fred and Tom, sometimes in Swansea again. How is that blizzardly painter, that lightning artist, that prodigal canvas stacker? Please give him my love. And come Donkin Park, I wish we were there now.
They were all conscious of being Welsh. Vernon and Dylan always said they were Welsh poets. Although Dylan, of course, always liked to shock, you know, land of my fathers can have it. I think he loved Wales. Swansea was really the place of his heart, I think.
Thomas, Watkins, Jones, Janes, Richards and gifted company. It seems extraordinary that so many major artists should have launched themselves on the world from the same place at more or less the same time. Extraordinary but not inexplicable. The Cardoma boys had talent in abundance, and in their frontier kind of town, a perfect creative context.
So was Swansea itself the catalyst which released their creative talent? In a radio script written by Dylan Thomas, Alfred Janes, Vernon Watkins, Daniel Jones and John Pritchard, they considered exactly that possibility.
3 writers, a painter and a composer, have come together in a suburb of Swansea where maybe once a sweeter life, hay-made in the old gold dog days, to talk about, more or less, how they regard the town of their birth or upbringing as a place in which to do their work. I accept myself for the moment. Though Swansea bore me, and though indeed I have bored Swansea in my time, I do not now live in it. I am by nature a globe-trotter. I live in the next county.
Swansea is so full of contrasts and conflicts and contradictions, and these, provided they're not sufficiently violent to bring him to a standstill altogether, are important to an artist. They stimulate him, jog his mind and keep his imagination in good fettle. It's a town of conflicts and contrasts, all right. Coal trimming and county cricket. The port versus the parish. From Sadie's Cafe to Capel Gomer is surely the longest mile in the world.
The life in the docks, the sounds of the Welsh language on the streets, the market, the hustle and bustle of traffic and trams and so on. All of those things were there, I think, as very formative experiences.
The character of Swansea is in the people rather than the place. And their friendliness, humour and enthusiasm make me well content to live among them. Above all, it is in Swansea that nearly all my closest friends live. Many are artists. They're not in the same line as myself. Each of us takes a lively interest in the other's work and is able to provide sincere and outspoken criticism of it.
Vernon said of it, it was like a revelation. Suddenly he was introduced into this circle of young men, and they were all very, very interested in art. He said that pre-war Swansea was an era and an excitement that could never be repeated.
Swansea is a town where art is alive. If it became a cultural centre or resort where art was fashionable and where it was always being discussed but never created, it would be a town where art was dead.
We belong, I think, to a unique generation. We're the first boys that ever tickled the crystal with a cat's whisker, and now here we are in a studio in Swansea. But we are also the first generation, possibly in the world, to be denied our native language, not by statutory rule or government decree, but by the deliberate choice of our parents. All of us present have or had either one or two Welsh-speaking parents. Not one of us can speak Welsh.
I like to think of that group as being one which was expressing a new Wales which was coming into being. The old chapel-dominated Wales, the old work ethic-dominated Wales, and especially the Welsh language Wales, were all beginning to lose their command. And as a result, a new Wales was beginning to be born. And I think this, historically, is a time when things change and produces a spur to artistic and creative expression. The old no longer holds sway, and the young, as it were, with impunity can strike out in a different direction. And at the same time, because they have a different reality to describe, they want to break out in a new direction. So it was the means, if you like, and then the inspiration.
To end, may I say why I like Swansea so much? Why I used to work so freely and happily in it, why I love coming back to it as often as I can, and why I still live near to it. It's because it's the most romantic town I know. And I haven't time to say any more than that.
By about 37, 38, the war was on the horizon, you know, the Italian war with Abyssinia. I think they could see the end of this totally free time coming. And of course Dylan was married. And once he was married and had a child coming, money began to press on him in a way that it never had before.
With the advent of war, many of the group were drawn into the armed forces, and Dylan earned his living writing scripts for propaganda films.
Who sent us to kill, to be killed, to lose what we love? Widowed our women, unfathered our sons, broke the hearts of our homes. Who dragged us out of our beds and houses and workshops, into a battle yard of spilt blood and split bones? Who set us at the throats of our comrades? Who is to blame? What men set man against man? Shout, shout, shout out their name.
I was at Bletchley, and so was Vernon, fooling about with Enigma, you know, and intelligence. Ha ha. I used to think that they'd shut everybody up in Bletchley, that was the only reason we won the war, because, you know, all the really mad people were shut up in Bletchley. Of course, Dan was at Bletchley too, and Dylan wrote, "How is Dan? His army trousers kept up with string, trailing his harassed women like seaweed."
He did alter people's lives drastically, and For instance, I went into the army at 29 and came out at 35. This is the middle cut. One had already got one's work into London galleries and so on. And then came the war, and I did a few drawings during the war, but one was lucky to get out of it, I suppose, unscathed.
Not so the Cardoma Cafe. By 1941, it had been flattened by bombs. The energy of the group had rippled around the world, but a golden age had passed.
After the Blitz in Swansea, Dylan, of course, was devastated. He walked among Swansea ruins with the tears rolling down his face. He came to stay with us, and he said, "Our Swansea is gone. It's gone." He was totally moved by this.
In Return Journey, Dylan wrote about his Swansea of before the war.
I wonder if you can tell me whether you used to know a chap called Young Thomas.
Oh, him. I haven't seen him since the old Cardoma days. Him and Tom Warner and Fred James, drinking coffee dashes and arguing the toss.
What about?
Music and poetry, painting and politics. Einstein and Epstein, Stravinsky and Greta Garbo, death and religion, Picasso and girls.
As Dylan got better known, he had this circle of admirers who expected him to show off and be witty all the time. And the old friends got pushed out to the edge, and in any case didn't like seeing what I used to call instant Dylan, you know, this switched on wit and showing off. I think this tired Dylan immensely too. He used to be very bad-tempered.
Mary and I drove Kerry down to Larne, and we spent a lovely day with Dylan. We drove out to Amross and boozing all the way back. And that was the last time I saw Dylan. Then we had this message from Dan a couple of days later that he'd gone. But I know that he was suffering from blackouts at that time. He said he'd been having blackouts, and almost his last words, he said, "I'm only going to pay the bills."
Dylan died in a New York hospital in November 1953. He was buried in Larne, and the Cardoma group gathered for a final time.
For a young writer, the seduction of Dylan Thomas is twofold. I was 16 when I stumbled across his poetry in the school library and realized that this thrillingly incomprehensible sensualist of language was the same bad Swansea boy the older members of my family were always tutting about. I wanted to be a poet, and here was my permission. I drank deep of the legend and cooking sherry. I penned deliriously forth in what I believed was Dylan mode. I was all, for years, self-indulgent, meaningless waffle.
Everybody wanted to be Dylan. Everybody wanted to write a Dylan poem. Everybody wanted to do a Dylan. If they couldn't write his poetry, they could anyway throw a shenanigan in a pub. That was always, I think, his appeal to people. Of course, it created a lot of groupies, most of whom have passed away. But at the same time, it created, I think, a lot of stimulus for a lot of other writers to take courage in their own hands and perhaps fashion for themselves a voice of their own.
But later, I went back, and there were things to learn.
The poems which I think of as being most remarkable, most original, and most magnetic are the early poems, some of the images of which occasionally ring a bell, most of which bowls you over by the sheer extraordinariness of the expression, but which you haven't a hope of unravelling. Quite a lot of readers are now beginning to try to come to grips with that and give a different account of Dylan, which explores the ways in which he is very extraordinarily new.
Swansea has always had an ambivalent relationship with its most famous son. The most fitting memorial is, of course, his work, commemorated here in Cwmdonkin Park.
Nothing I cared
in the lamb-white days that time would take me up to the swallow-thronged loft by the shadow of my hand, in the moon that is always rising, nor that riding to sleep I should hear him fly with the high fields and wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea.
If Dylan's reputation is set for a revival, the work of his friends remains the preserve of archivists and academics. Vernon Watkins' publisher launches a book in Swansea, and no one buys it. Daniel Jones's CDs are unavailable in the shops. The work of Fred James is much loved and so remains in the hands of private collectors or in other inaccessible corners.
There have been some very interesting exhibitions of his work fairly recently, and so his work is now becoming a bit better known, but I suppose he has been overshadowed. Thankfully, Alfred James is still going strong, and I think his time is very much still to come.
I think if the word genius could be applied to anybody, it should be applied to someone like Vernon Watkins, but a forgotten genius, alas, a neglected genius. And I think for everybody who reads a poem by Dylan Thomas, they should read some by Vernon Watkins.
You can put plaques onto stone walls wherever you like, but a plaque is a plaque, isn't it? I'm sure what he would like would be performances of his works and a realization by a younger generation that his work has a quality that speaks now, as it probably will in the best of his work, for a long time to come.
Their legacy lives on. They were passionately committed to their craft and art, which is as modern as can be and often difficult. They challenge both artists and audiences in Wales and beyond to risk and accept experiment, dare the great universal themes, and to remember that roots are quite as important as wings.